I have the great privilege of being here today with Renée Lertzman. Renée, thank you so much for coming on the Middleway podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
So I have been really excited to talk to you because your work is at the intersection of psychology and climate action and inaction and stagnation. And I think you offer a really unique and important kind of perspective and insight into what's happening here on a psychological level in our sort of collective consciousness and social space. But I was hoping maybe you could just share a bit about your background and how you got into this work. I know you have a background in psychology, but as a psychologist, how did you stumble into climate work and started to
Mhm.
blend those two things together?
Right. Yeah, thank you. I touch on this a little bit in the TED Talk I gave in 2019, where I described the experience I had of basically being a very young person, 18, 19, very passionate about psychology. I had already benefited from my own psychotherapy at that time. And I just, found psychology endlessly fascinating. And so there I was sort of on this track to become a therapist, which in my experience at that time was, the way to channel help ways, way to help people basically. And then I ended up, you know, enrolling in an environmental studies class, like one of those big one-on 101 lectures. And, there I was in these big lecture halls and every week learning about a different, pretty intense, catastrophic planetary issue. So it wasn't specific to climate. It was really the whole array of, um, degradation and ways that humans have, through industrialization, um, and oppression and all of that, have created these conditions that have led to a lot of loss and impact. And so I had that experience of going through that class, which I found to be very destabilizing. And at the same time, I was taking all of my psychology classes, and again, I'm a freshman, it's all the one-on-one like introductory classes. And this was at UC Santa Cruz. And I was taking, social psychology with a very well-known social psychologist named Elliot Aronson. And he was talking to us about these topics of cognitive dissonance. He was talking about aggression, he was talking about prejudice. And to me, it just felt very strange that we weren't connecting the dots between these fields at the time. This was in the late 1980s. And I immediately saw environmental and climate issues through the lens of trauma, very intuitively, very obvious to me. So from that moment on, it seemed, odd to not connect, the experience of climate and environmental degradation through the lens of human psychology, and especially around trauma and around, anxiety, and how do humans come to terms with what we've done, right? So it just sort of opened that all up to me. And to me, that was the piece that we were not really talking about enough, which is what are those conditions that really support us to face and go through that kind of reckoning and processing of where we are and where we want to go.
Hmm. So here we are, we find ourselves 2024. We've inflicted lots of trauma on the earth.
Mm-hmm.
We've been traumatized. We maybe are maybe that part of that is coming from trauma. So I think, hardly anyone would deny that we're having a significant impact on the earth. But here we find ourselves in a highly politicized environment.
Mhm.
And sort of it feels like, yes, there's been some movement and action, but it also in a place of stagnation. And I feel like maybe like 30, 40 years ago, maybe the problem there was just ignorance and naivety.
Mhm.
But there wasn't a charge around it. There wasn't, if no one was against taking action or supporting the earth. And now we sort of find ourselves in this, again, highly political place. So first of all, is that how you see it? And second of all, like, how did we get here
Mhm.
in your view?
Right. I love that you're asking this question. I'm feeling very grateful for going right to the heart of this kind of where we are right now, which is my my interpretation is a kind of existential psychological moment we're in, which is precisely the fact that the more charged, so again, everything I'm doing and talking about and bringing into my work with organizations and leaders and teams, it's all grounded in what we already know about psychology and particularly the neuroscience and the what Dan Siegel, the work that he's developing has been developing interpersonal neurobiology, which is to say how we process and make sense of and engage with triggers and stress and all of that. So the moment we're in is that there is this charge that the higher the stakes and the more charge there is, we already know what humans tend to do. We know that humans tend to want to protect themselves, want to maintain a status quo, want to maintain a sense of security and safety. And if that's not acknowledged and addressed, if that's not really met, what happens is rise in polarization, a rise in all the dynamics around shame, blame, othering, all those things. And, a lot of this was already mapped out, frankly, over 100 years ago. I was trained as a psychoanalytic researcher initially, and I know that's not it might come back in vogue. I know The Guardian did a piece recently that was saying that psychoanalysis was having a resurgence, and that's not surprising to me because it already mapped out what has been supported through the neuroscience, which is, oh, when humans feel threatened, when we feel unsafe, we tend to do these certain things, which is acting out, the polarizing, the othering, the all of that. So that's what we're in right now. So we're in that kind of moment because a lot of people are feeling a profound sense of anxiety and uncertainty and fear. And so, unless the conditions are in place to support people in feeling like, hey, you're okay, I'm okay, let's kind of look at what's happening here. Unless that context, we will continue and are continuing to see increased um, dynamics playing out that make it very hard to actually have the conversations we need to be having.
I personally would not be upset if psychoanalysis made a bit of a comeback. I think it gets a bit of a bad rap, in my
Hmm.
opinion.
Yeah.
Um, but so you're pointing to kind of this highly charged environment, high stakes environment because the stakes are going up.
Hmm.
And because of that, people, rightfully so, are feeling very passionate about wanting
Hmm.
to take action.
Yeah.
Um, but the
Yeah.
reason I love your work is because you're sort of peeling back the curtain on what's actually happening there when people are taking action in a highly energized way and
Hmm.
what happens in response to that and kind of the neurobiology of it. So, can you talk a little bit more about that? Like maybe what's happening, either psychologically or neurobiologically as this sort of shame, blame, judgment
Hmm.
type of behavior starts to come out because the stakes are so.
Right. Right. So I work primarily with people who identify as change makers, change leaders, um, activists, but mainly I work with change agents within organizations. And I've also spent decades, interviewing and working closely with all kinds of people who are trying to make change happen in the world. And I spent my early years after college working in the nonprofit sector, where I had a very direct access to how a lot of advocacy work happens. And what I experienced early on then and still see now is that when we see events in the world, situations in the world, systems that need to be changed and addressed, we tend to want to meet that with our passion, our need to make change happen. And what I've observed is that often it's that sense of urgency that is really can really drive the bus. And that a lot of people, especially younger, as we come into this, and this is what I went through, was this desire to want to get out there and really just wake people up. And what I call yelling, telling, and selling, which is, we want to tell people what's going on. Don't you see, this is what's happening. We want to yell and shake people and sort of try to incite some sort of moral or ethical rage or response. Or we sell, which is the cheerleader. This is the positivity, like really let me try to inspire you and make you feel inspired to want to do something. And so usually there's these yell, tell, and sell are happening in a variety of combinations. And it was not until I started really engaging with the field of motivational interviewing in the public health sector, where I realized that there was this whole body of work that's evidence-based that is related to how clinicians have been working with people, especially in public health, around really hard, intractable behavior change. And I sort of stumbled into this through a colleague of mine in the UK, Rosemary Randall, who is a psychoanalytically trained psychologist who, realized that motivational interviewing, or MI for short, has some pretty kind of shorthand for looking at these ways of trying to make change happen and what actually really works. And so from the MI world, I drew on this whole notion of what it, I talk on project. I have a website, an initiative called Project Inside Out, and it was started by a grant from the KR Foundation initially. And what I did is I sort of experimented with taking some of these insights from MI and from other kinds of psychology and trauma to come up with some tools and guiding principles. And so there I talk about educating, cheerleading, writing with an RIGHT, like and then what does it mean to guide? And that's taken really borrowed heavily from the MI world, where they introduced me to this idea of writing versus guiding, and how most of us who are helpers and want to make positive change in the world can default and fall into this, what the founders of MI called the writing reflex, which is, this is the right thing to do. This is, don't you see what you're doing? Like, unless we stop doing this, this is what's going to happen. And they really invite us into a different posture. And that different posture is one of a guide, that really your job is to draw out, from others what their, concerns are, values, volition for change. It's a very different kind of energetics. And it's actually like massively more impactful and effective than the writing, the, educating, and the cheerleading, or what I call yell, tell, and sell.
Yeah. I love this image of someone shaking somebody, because that's what it can feel like sometimes. And we've all been there. We've all been the shaker, and we've all been shaked, whether
Mm-hmm.
it's on the topic of climate or something else.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But we all know what it feels like to be shaked. And when someone is shaking us and yelling and telling and cheerleading us, of course, we shut down, we become resistant, we double down on our ideas and ideology. So, could you paint a picture for us of like when someone is in the guiding position, what that
Mm,
looks like, or if you were
mm.
working with a leader, let's say,
Yeah,
in an organization, like how would you guide them to adopt this different posture?
right. So it starts with um self practices around self-awareness and what I refer to as attuning and being attuned. Um, so I will just say I have these five guiding principles that I came up with through the work with Project Inside Out that I think in a way are kind of a playbook for this way of guiding. And the first is attune. So attuning is about not only attuning and being in touch with yourself, practicing and learning kind of regulation. If folks the notion of self-regulation, how do we work with our own triggers, our own activation, how are we resource, like we need to be investing in that kind of work right now is fundamental. There's really is no way around it. There is no there's no shortcut. You have to do the work of um deciding I'm going to, show up in the best way possible. And that includes really doing the personal work on, how am I showing up and what's driving me and all of that. So there's that.
Mhm.
And then the second guiding principle is reveal is about how do we tell the truth about what we see and what's happening? How do we communicate and engage with people in a way that's compassionate and skillful? And then the third is equip. So how do we, look at our work as, again, this is taken from the MI world and the guiding, which is how can I support you? How can I enable you? How can I help you? Right? Like what resources do you need? Convene is the fourth, which is bringing people together with the intention of having conversations, interaction. And then the fifth is sustain, which is keeping things going, this kind of sense of engagement. So if we want to get very, specific about it, the way a guide shows up is you start first with, after this kind of being in touch with yourself is a lot of listening and being attuned to your stakeholders, to your organization. So if I'm working with a leader in a company um, who wants to drive sustainability or ESG or climate through the organization, the first step is attuning. And we think of that sometimes as discovery phase. I really prefer the language of attunement because it's coming out of the, you know, neurobiology of relationship, and that when people feel and are attuned, magic can happen. And so that might take the form of listening tours. It might take the form of surveys with interviews. It might take the form of town halls. It could take the, form of, uh, various ways of bringing people together and really listening and really tuning into what are those anxieties people might have, what are the ambivalence, the aspirations, and so forth. And then what's really important is to be able to take that, and the role of the guide is that ideally you are not the one doing all what's called change talk. In MI, there's that language, this terminology of change talk. And change talk is any kind of expression of, you know, I will do something differently, or I'm open to doing something differently, or what am I, it's all about what am I going to do? And often the activists or the change makers, we take on that role too much. And we do that for other people, as opposed to saying, hey, what do you think? What ideas do you have, or what do you imagine might be possible? So what I'm describing sounds like it's something that only works in a one-on-one situation, but it doesn't. It actually can inform an entire strategy of how a company or an organization does what they do, which is really modeling and embodying this posture of an empathetic guide who's here to be kind of a companion along the way of whatever work we're looking at, and really showing up as that convener, someone that really is interested in bringing people together. And so I've seen this happen in a whole variety of ways. It could be having small groups and cohorts that meet over time in a company or an organization. It could be a sustainability team revising their strategy so that instead of going out and giving a lot of presentations, they actually invite people in to be part of, more interactive, like salons or workshops, or, anything that really fosters like really the interactivity.
Hmm. If someone's listening, Renee, and they're thinking about kind of this shift in posture or approach from
Mhm.
more of kind of educating, or we might say kind of a top-down approach, to this shift of being open and receptive and listening, and
Mhm.
maybe someone is thinking like, why would listening to someone who maybe is a climate denier or climate skeptic or has all these bad ideas, like why would that be more effective than kind of the status quo approach that we're using now? Can you help us understand sort of the power behind and the
Mhm.
mechanisms behind this different posture?
Well, does yelling, telling, and selling work? I mean, I kind of think we have the answer. It hasn't worked for a long time. Um, Carl Rogers, the psychologist who's kind of founded the whole humanistic psychology movement, um, he has a very, famous phrase around the paradox of change. The paradox of change is, and I'm paraphrasing, when people feel accepted for who they are most likely to change. So our job is to create the conditions that enable people to feel honored and respected and accepted. It doesn't mean agree with, it doesn't mean tolerate, it doesn't mean we're not still needing to fight injustice. I mean, I'm not suggesting anything like that. I'm talking about um, the mechanisms of real transformative change work involve relationship, and they involve usually some form of cultivating trust. So I did actually engage in a project several years ago with a Republican. I got called from a senior advisor for the Republican Party. This was before Trump, so it was in 2017. Wait, no, sorry, it was like 2014.
For the first Trump, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And the project was to craft messaging about climate change for Republican climate skeptics. And what we did is we went out and did in-depth interviews with dozens of people around the United States. And we did those interviews. I trained the team to do the interviews using a method that is really grounded in deep listening. And as opposed to the usual message testing, like, what do you think of this word? And do you agree with this? So when I say X, Y, and Z, what comes to mind for you? Those kinds of questions. What comes up for you? Or what do you think, And so what we heard in those interviews were really profound accounts of, and I'm talking about hard skeptics. I'm talking about people who absolutely believe this is not true, it's a hoax. What we found listening to people is, in fact, there was this fundamental sense of feeling aggrieved, of feeling left out of important conversations and so forth. And that they were being kind of basically shut down and talked to. And so what we found is that we were able to get alignment around, look, we all care about the planet. Like, we care about nature. We care about our kids. We care about, having, this was a very American focus, having wide open spaces and, like that whole, all of that. And then we kind of moved into, you might be feeling, this is, now I'm talking about the messaging that we crafted and tested, was affirming and acknowledging, you might be feeling really angry. You might be feeling really aggrieved. You might be feeling like, who the hell is this Al Gore flying around, And we said all of that very openly. And then we found that people began to track with us on a message that was moving in the direction of doing something about climate change with hard and soft skeptics. So I know from experience that it's not about necessarily convincing or persuading. It's about guiding. And we're not going to get everyone either. So I'm not saying, waste our time trying to, get everyone on the same page. I'm just saying, it's kind of incredible what happens. And it's very disarming when we show up in a posture of listening and guiding. It's not expected. It's, it's refreshing. We're having to do a lot of repair right now from decades of people feeling preached at and moralized and patronized.
Such a beautiful example of how that listening and meeting people where they are and developing that human connection opens up something entirely different and counterintuitively actually creates the conditions for change.
Mm-hmm.
It sort of reminds me, there's a documentary by a filmmaker named Dia Khan called White Right. She's made a couple of them. But in the film, she goes and she talks to in, neo-Nazis in America, basically people, and she's a Muslim woman. So these are people who have strong beliefs against her. And her posture is she shows up, she interviews them, she listens to them, she goes on a road trip with them, she just spends time with them. And
Yeah.
by the end of the film, you see people have that cognitive dissonance where they're starting to realize, oh my God, I have affection for this person. I don't know that I can, I can't hold both of these things at the same time. And, that actually creates some sort of condition for behavior change. So it's this very kind of counterintuitive approach, but I
Mm-hmm.
love how in your work you really highlight and magnify the importance of having relationships, which is the hard part. It's a lot
Yeah.
easier to have a megaphone and to tweet, but then to actually get in the room in the trenches with someone and build a relationship, that's much harder. And maybe that explains why, partly explains why we are where we are today with
Yeah.
talking to each other.
Yeah, exactly.
Can you talk briefly about the three A's? You've identified the three A's and how these could either be kind of like barriers to
Mm-hmm.
behavior change or opportunities for behavior change. What are the three A's in the realm of climate psychology?
Uh-huh. Um, so the three A's is a framework I use that is not exhaustive by any means, but it's kind of a tool to use when we're wanting to pay attention and acknowledge what might be going on for people around these issues. So the first A is anxiety. And this can relate to anxiety about not just climate anxiety, but I'm talking about anxiety about the proposed solutions, talking about anxiety about change. So I'm really trying to broaden this concept of climate anxiety, which I think resonates for some people and not for others, because you could always say, well, not everyone feels anxious about climate change. And what I'm trying to say is existential threats evoke anxiety in a whole variety of different ways, depending on who you are and where you are and what your circumstances are and where you are in your level of, survival and existential threat in all kinds of ways. So So anxiety is the first A that invites us to really listen for and attune to what might be going on that brings up people's anxieties. The second A is ambivalence. And that, again, is inspired by the research and behavior change and motivational interviewing, which talks a lot about ambivalence and that we have to engage with ambivalence if we're talking about any kind of change. This is hugely missed in the climate space, hugely. We're just not talking about what is ambivalence and how does it stall people out. Ambivalence technically is when people have competing, conflicting feelings, beliefs, and even values. So it's that classic, like, well, on the one hand, I want to be doing something about climate change. On the other hand, I don't want to have to give up certain things, or what are people going to think about me, or I don't know enough to do something about it, or it's literally ambivalence. And ambivalence or ambivalence is also a very popular term in psychoanalysis. I mean, Freud talked about ambivalence. The founders of the psychoanalysis were very big on ambivalence. And the reason why is because it is a feature of human psychology that when we're confronted with change, we often feel mixed feelings. And the way to deal with ambivalence is you have to shine a light on it and you have to bring it out and evoke and have it really be named and talked about. You don't get over it, you work through it. And so people trained, for example, in MI really understand this very deeply. They have to. So you're working with someone around, smoking or, diet or whatever. And it's like you're coming up against these barriers of, well, I don't know. And so you have to figure out ways of working with that. And I think that needs to be scaled. That has to be, anyone working on climate change and consumption, and we have to talk about ambivalence and work with it. And then the third A is aspiration, which is, for me, aspiration is about what are our human aspirations. So I'm, very inspired by research around belonging, around inclusion, around, people aspire to have impact and to feel safe. And so a lot of climate folks go right to the aspiration, and that's where we get into being cheerleaders to say, oh, this is, this is going to lead to positive outcomes or whatever, and we're skipping the anxiety and the ambivalence. And when I think about aspiration, I also think a lot about the work that has been done around intrinsic motivation. We've known about intrinsic motivation for decades. And one of the people that made that work more well-known is Dan Pink, who wrote a book called Drive. And in his book, he outlines, hey, this is what the research says about intrinsic motivation, which is what really motivates people. And he very cleverly basically said it's autonomy, mastery, and purpose. So he did, what I'm trying to do, which is to take a lot of research and distill it into something really simple. And he did that very effectively. Autonomy, mastery, and purpose. If you just keep those three aspirations in mind, that's very powerful, right? And so the challenge we have is to hold all of these threes together in the work that we're doing, whether it's around race and equity, whether it's around, food issues, whether it's around climate change, a whole variety of existential threats.
Mm-hmm. And Renee, you work with leaders in the space, and you have a project you mentioned, or an organization called Project Inside Out. Can you just say a few words on that?
Yeah, so I do work as a consultant and advisor with organizations, and I was given a grant from a foundation called KR a number of years ago as an experiment to see if I could bring some people together and come up with some tools and resources. And so that's what Project Inside Out is. And we have been funded by grants. We're now sort of at a crossroads where we're kind of looking at, well, what's the next step for this work? So if anyone listening is interested, we're looking at how to build this out and scale this work out more, which is specifically around guiding and around inviting people into what does it mean to be a guide, and what are the skills and what's involved with, and not surprisingly, that includes, being able to look at our theories of change and look at how are we showing up as, cheerleaders, educators, writers, or guides, learning about those 3 A's and so forth. And we recently ran some learning journey pilots. So I've been experimenting with like a 6-week journey, a 2-day masterclass that I offered with the inner development goals, who are partners. So it's sort of this like body of work that I'm developing and looking at, well, how to operationalize that a bit more. But I'm very excited about it because it brings together inner work with outer work. It's like we don't really separate those things.
Hmm.
It's not like, oh, let's focus on mental health and emotional stuff over here, and then there's the work itself over here. It's like, no, it's actually has to be really integrated. And we need support of others. We need groups and cohorts and community to support ourselves in how we develop, which is happening on many fronts right now. It's a very dynamic space.
Awesome. Well, I will certainly link to that in the show notes so that people can check it out and follow along and get involved if they want to.
Great.
Anything else that we haven't talked about today that you wanted to add to the conversation before we wrap up?
I would just say, like, the concept I've been running with for a while now is this idea of apathy, and how easy it is to, when people aren't as activated or kind of mobilized in ways that are needed in the world right now, to pause and consider what else might be going on that is getting in the way of our ability to express our care and love for the world. And so I'm, really big on this idea of, what I call the myth of apathy, which is that it's easy to label inaction, to label what's not happening as a kind of apathy, like, oh, people don't care, they don't care enough, we have to make people care. How do we get people to care? And my work is really interrogating that and offering a reframe to say, well, what if it's not a matter of whether people care or not, but what do people care about? And how can we really foster those conditions so that people can come into that more easily? And that relates to how, again, it goes back to how are we showing up? Are we showing up with that spirit of compassion and fierceness, as well as, this compassion, ability to have compassion and empathy for, wow, like, these are hard times, like, there's a lot going on right now. How do we meet this moment from that place of what this woman, Loretta Ross, who's really been inspiring me recently, talks about, really leaning into love and respect when we see wrongdoing. Just seems really kind of at cross purposes, but what she's saying is 100% right, which is we need to really be doing, less of the calling out and more of the calling in. And she describes calling in as precisely this capacity to really have conversations, to inquire, to say, hey, that didn't work for me, what just happened there. Let's talk about it, or help me understand what just happened. She also does talk about the option of calling off, which is to say we don't always have to engage in these conversations either. I think that's extremely important to remember. It's not about like, oh, we all have to go out and, no. I mean, if there's like some stuff going down that's not okay, that we don't, that's just not acceptable. It's not like, oh, we have to go and connect with everyone, but it's developing that discernment to say, when is it time to call in or call off, but she's saying no more calling out, which is the shaming and the blaming that just perpetuates the whole cycle we're in.
I love that. Call in or call off. There's an option to call off. We can take care
Yeah.
of ourselves too. And if we need to call off, we call off. And if
Hmm.
we have the capacity to call in, we can call in. So thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you
Yeah.
for that.
Hmm.
This is fantastic. I think this has been such a eye-opening conversation. I know for me, for other people, and just thank you so much for the work that you do and continue to do. Where can people find you? I'll put the link for Project Inside Out. Any other places that people can find you on the internet?
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thanks for hosting this conversation and the work you're doing as well. So if people want to learn more about Project Inside Out, there's a site called projectinsideout.net, all one word. So Project Inside Out is all together, .net. Um, and I just want to say that it's in progress. So, it's information, but people can go and kind of see what's there and sign up for a newsletter and be updated on what's happening. Or if you want to help out, or if you want to contribute to it in some way, that's where you can go. And then there's reneelertzman.com, which is my site where people can get in touch with me and kind of see a little bit more about what I'm up to.
Fantastic. And I've seen the Project Inside Out website. It looks great. And there are a lot of resources on there, and I've
Mhm.
downloaded some of them. So I would encourage
Good,
people to check it out. Thank
good.
you so much, Renee.
Thank you so much too.